Thank you very much, Thibault, for your introduction and your invitation to participate in this conference. Also, thank you all who have chosen to share your morning or evening or afternoon or whatever it may be with me today. What I will be doing is really presenting some early research today on a much larger scale than is commonly practiced. And so apologies in advance if I get anything wrong, because it's certainly a big topic, but I think it is uh, hopefully a good time to start thinking about the Black Sea in a big picture way, and so that's one reason why I've carved out this much larger topic than I have in most of my publications and in previous field research. It's also a beginning of a new, hopefully a new field collaboration that will address some of the questions raised here. So I suppose the big question here is asking what is the Iron Age and how did what characterized social systems in the Iron Age? How can we characterize the Iron Age? What is it that's special about the Iron Age? And and what about the Iron Age in the big picture is led to certain patterns of cultural change, sharing, transformation, ultimately political transformation, and the emergence of the famous kingdoms around the Black Sea. And I suppose it's probably not a bad idea to start with what did people who lived in the Iron Age think about the Iron Age. And Hesiod has his famous characterization of the Iron Age, a time when men never rest from labor and sorrow by day, perish by night. So a time of labor and danger, violence. One man will sack another city. There's no favor for the man who keeps his oath, which suggests it's a time when there was a certain amount of ritual and religious transformation as things changed. That would have seemed like a very challenging moment for people who were accustomed to relatively stable systems of belief. Strength will be right, reverence will cease to be, the wicked will hurt the worthy man. These are all connected, I believe, with the idea of transformation, social transformation. The people who had been the lower level people are now being promoted to higher positions in society, and so these are the kinds of shifts that we might think about happening in one of the Iron Age societies of Eurasia. And I put it this way because I would like to frame the whole question as including cultures like the Assyrians, the Persians, the Anatolian cultures, the Greeks, who are generally seen as sort of special exceptions, see them rather as part of the Iron Age picture, encompassed within the concept of the Iron Age. So, of course, we have the modern conception of the three ages, the Stone Age, Bronze Age, and Iron Age, going back to the late 19th or early 19th century. Here we see from the Exposition Universelle the sort of diorama approach to representing uh, stone, bronze, and iron ages as material culture, types, object types, and so forth. And to some extent, this approach, of course, here we see the Iron Age exhibition. Um, this approach is one that has been very persistent in our minds. In other words, thinking about local cultures, thinking about distinctions between very specific patterns in material culture. Now, part of this is related to the way the Iron Age came to have meaning in Europe. The idea of European nationalism sort of evolving together with the concepts of the Iron Age. So we see Caesar's famous quote, Gaul united, forming a single nation, animated by a common spirit, can defy the universe, as a characterization of what has uh, what the Gallic spirit has the potential for. Of course, in the Vercingetorix monument here that we see, perhaps ancient Alesia, um, we can see this image then of the personification of the Gallic spirit in Vercingetorix, is then in a way highly connected with the idea of French uh, sort of identity. And so the Iron Age in basically uh, many different areas of Europe has come to be connected with the birth of what came to be national cultures. But again, let's zoom out a little bit in terms of time and space, in terms of geography. What if we were to imagine the Iron Age as a phenomenon that spread from the Volga to the Atlantic, encompassing the Caucasus and the Mediterranean? This would be, again, a grand uh, sweep that and a grand scale for thinking about the period in a very different way. In terms of climate, we have this tendency towards cooling temperatures at the beginning of the Iron Age, which may well have driven a certain amount of demographic movement and stress. But by the end of the Iron Age and the later Iron Age, there was a warming trend towards what became the Roman climatic optimum going forward. In terms of demography, I think the one thing about demography in the Iron Age that we can say is that people were on the move, both on land and by sea. And this was a time not only were people on the move in terms of migration and colonization, but also in terms of trade and so forth. So there was movement going on multiple levels. By the later Iron Age, we see in many cases a tendency towards territoriality, towards the definition, or at least the desire for definition, of more stable territory. In terms of social organization, we're probably moving from the early Iron Age to non-hierarchical, I'll argue in a moment, segmentary lineages, and a sense of corporate identity, that is, identity based on the group membership, and moving towards the end of the later Iron Age as a hierarchy of royal lineages, and the specialization in terms of the social and economic function. Settlements moved from, in the early Iron Age, a non-hierarchical heterarchy of community networks of small and relatively equal communities, movement towards this tendency of larger centers dominating territories. In terms of power, we see cultural and social capital including skills in warfare, feasting, ritual knowledge, and so forth, emphasized on the earlier side of the Iron Age, moving towards a world in which material proxies, especially metals in the forms of bodily adornments and prized consumable goods, uh, and also monumentality become the embodiments or expressions of culture. And in terms of economy, we're moving on the early side from a domestic mode to a more industrial, entrepreneurial sort of integration of this space. So, just a word or two about Kuras and Sastra's interesting new proposal that in northwestern Iberia, that is the West European Iberia, um, they argue that a segmentary model of organization can be posited for the extensive distribution of castro settlements, very long lasting, from the turn of the millennium down into the second century BC. So this was a long-lasting pattern of egalitarian settlement. Here in Castro Bornero, we can see a fortified hilltop or hill fort with, in this case, a rather dense agglomeration of buildings that are rather uniform in size and building techniques. No sense of real hierarchy detectable within this settlement. And so the idea of segmentary organization is that basically household units tend to be rather equivalent, egalitarian in that sense, even though there may be a certain amount of ranking and organization within households or within relatively small units, um, and that those units are integrated under a system where there are multiple uh, parallel structures across a wider territory for special operations, for special purposes. It's possible to unite the system and get quite a considerable labor force to undertake large projects like warfare or like monument building, but those tend to fission after the completion of a unifying project. And so this is the system that Couros and Sastra have argued uh, was responsible for a long-lasting tendency towards stable egalitarian communities. Then, towards the end of the first millennium, as the encroachment of Rome became a factor, we can see in this Castro distribution a movement from these smaller ones like Torosso Castro on the left here, the sort of classic Iron Age hill fort, to larger and more differentiated and organized castros like San Cibran de Las. And so we can see in the larger Castro here, we're talking about many hectares in scope, maybe about 300 or 400 meters across, with neighborhoods, with street systems, with a central fortified area, and so forth. So that we're looking at the emergence of something like a hierarchy that is, in a sense, fossilized into architecture. So what we see in Northwest Iberian Peninsula is from the early Iron Age, set of networked small castros, half a hectare or so in size, undifferentiated in terms of internal architecture and group investment in common rituals. So when there is a certain amount of wealth, it tends to be brought together, deposited in group rituals rather than aggrandizing a particular lineage. Then, with the Roman encroachment around the second century BC, we see these long-standing egalitarian leveling mechanisms sort of fall apart, and the late Iron Age is characterized by hierarchical settlement pattern with large castros organizing sort of networks of smaller ones, differentiation in terms of architecture within the large castros, and investment in prestige adornments and lineage-oriented funerary monuments. Now, it's interesting, I don't have time to go into all the details, especially about a faraway place, but the cultural quote unquote source for iconography, imagery, ritual, and so forth tends to be, these sources tend to be quite diverse, coming from different parts of temperate Europe or locally or from Romans or whatever. The point is not to identify the specific origins of those cultural elements. The point is to really think about what's happening um, about with the local communities that makes it attractive to, adopt certain kinds of unfamiliar or new material culture. Okay, so let's think about a toolkit here. How do we come to understand the processes by which these transformations are taking place? So I would like to just mention the work of Pierre Bourdieu, especially in the outline of a theory of practice, in which he develops the key concepts of habitus, that is the durably installed generative principle of regulated improvisations, which produces practices that tend to reproduce the regularities immanent in the objective conditions of the production of their generative principle. That means in the production of basically what we call culture and society, while adjusting to the demands inscribed as objective potentialities defined by the cognitive and motivating structures making up the habitus. So habitus is a kind of worldview that is created by repeated actions that are constantly being carried out, adapted, and evaluated by the community, um, and tend to be justified by storytelling, mythical or cultural traditions. And what happens is that habitus, in the process of being generated and regenerated over many iterations, that idea of practice generates the patterns in culture that anthropologists or also practitioners might observe. So, for example, nice example of engineering the American habitus back in the early 20th century. Emily Post wrote the famous book Etiquette that we can see here, in which there was this movement towards sort of broadening and standardizing American culture, how it is appropriate to, on your right-hand side, you can see eat your soup or cut your meat or lay out your tableware in preparation for a meal, either at home or perhaps hosting a meal. And based on how effectively and how well the host has carried out her duty, because of course this was a gendered activity back in 1922, that is hosting and preparation of such a meal. Um, we can see that perhaps a, a, a host would be seen as efficient or effective or knowledgeable or ignorant. And so through recurrent iterations, it was possible to establish table manners, for example, and those table manners were used to basically assess the cultural sort of capacity of a person. Okay. So then the second analytical bit of our toolkit is also from Pierre Bourdieu's other great book, The Distinction, Social Critique of the Just Judgment of Taste. And in this distinction, he develops the concept of the field of social action and the multiple forms of capital. So a field of social action we can think out on multiple levels, but one way to think about a field of social action is a whole array of different sort of different roles in society. Some of those roles tend to be quite high in terms of the earned cultural knowledge it takes to carry them out. So artists and universities tend to be highly score very high on the cultural capital scale, or university professors, I would say. So the vertical axis here is um, it looks at the cultural capital, the economic capital. Uh, Sorry, the economic capital is the vertical, I guess, and then the cultural capital is the horizontal. So farmers or unskilled workers tend to score rather low in terms of economic and cultural capital. And so people are sort of in different positions on the social mapping field of any given community. And the idea behind distinction is that um, individual actors wish to move up and move into different positions on this mapping, on this field of social action. So if we think about a Greek polis, for example, we see honor on the horizontal here, the economic potential on the vertical, and we might think of a hetaira or a slave as relatively low on the honor and economic side. On the other side, the strategos or the archon might map near the top of both economic um, and honor or prestige. On the other hand, a trader might not get so much honor, but might be quite well positioned in terms of economic position. This is something I've worked on in a forthcoming article, Gathering Spaces, where I applied these ideas to Sinope. Okay. Then, in terms of capital, uh, breaking down capital into multiple different elements, we might think about economic capital, money, versus social capital, which might have to do with the family you come from, or the social position that someone happens to be in, and cultural capital being those earned aspects of culture, those learned behaviors. Okay, so here we have economic capital, a nice Sinope coin on the left here. Social capital might connect with the family, that background. Cultural capital might be the things like Emily Post's dining knowledge of dining etiquette that might be deployed to increase one's position in society. Okay, so now finally getting to the Eurasian Iron Age. On the left here, we can think about the early Iron Age, when there was a tendency to deposit large hoards with metallic wealth and weapons and prestigious items as a kind of corporate thing. Um, on the other hand, as we start to think towards the transition towards a more hierarchical society, we can think about the depositions of such hoards, not in a ritual space, but in a space that's connected with particular lineages, with particular families. So we can see the promotion of certain uh, um, certain elements of social capital for certain families, promotion of those families through the expenditure of economic capital in this case. And so on the earlier phase, we're looking at a kind of egalitarian leveling mechanism. In the later phase, we're looking at a movement towards hierarchy, establishment of hierarchy. And we can think about this in many different ways. For example, the building of earthworks, including, of course, the great kurgans of Eurasia. The Chertomlik kurgan has been estimated as representing something like 35,000 man days of effort because of its immense, astonishing scale. So this represents an enormous expenditure of social uh, capital on the part of probably the what we can call a king, somebody who can mobilize that much labor uh, for a showy monument, and that expenditure then creates a monument that helps establish the lineage's importance in a landscape. Um, Now, what we tend to see is uh, in the early Iron Age, there's not much emphasis on lineages, on particular families in the Eurasian Iron Age. But then as we move into really the 6th and 5th centuries, we start to see a much greater spread of monuments that do connect with families, that do connect with the representation of family or lineage status. Okay, now let's apply this to the Hillforts, to a number of case studies. We're going to start, of course, with the forest steppe, the emergence of large hill forts from the 7th century is in many ways parallel to what we saw in northwestern Iberia. That is, for example, the Nemiroff hill fort is an example of what Dargan has called mega hill forts. And we see it's a large 123 hectare site with an internally differentiated sort of architectural um, organization. Um, Bilsk Hillfort, of course, the grandest and most impressive of all the Eurasian hill forts. The west fortification here, which may have been the earlier settlement area, has a fortified area of 88 hectares. In at least the early phase, it seems not to have a terribly differentiated interior space. The scale of Bilsk, of course, is absolutely astonishing with a 30 kilometer uh, city wall or fortification wall. Massive community collaboration is evident here, even though the tendency seems to be relatively less um, relatively less obvious hierarchy, and I'll get to that in a sec. Um, but the scale of this project, let's say, is somewhere in the order of 100 times grander than the scale of the Chertomlik uh, tumulus. So are we talking about something like almost 500,000 man days of effort represented here? So again, remember I mentioned this idea of the segmentary systems. They can organize extraordinary scales of collaborators and workers to engage in warfare or monument building or something else, um, even though they tend not to be connected to permanent hierarchies. That may well be what we see going on in the earlier phases at Bilsk. It does seem like there is a certain amount of differentiation with in the eastern fortified area, for example, the concentration of Greek ceramics, in particular, concentration of drinking cups, of cantharoi in particular, may connect with some sense of differentiation within this broader community. Even though there is a fair amount of imported Greek pottery here, it does not seem to be a what you might call a Greek pattern of usage. It's a very specialized pattern of usage. Now, it is true that a certain amount of wealth is present in the tumuli next to Bilsk or adjacent to Bilsk. So the Skorober necropolis, the 2016 excavations, for example, if we look up here, the 2016 Tumulus 1 did turn up a relatively wealthy robbed out tomb, including this lovely golden plaque with a wild goat, so that there seems to be, to some extent, by the 5th century BC, some level of differentiation, but it's surprisingly low compared to, of course, what comes later. Other 2023 excavated tumuli, we can see more typical, rather mundane pottery, mundane horse trappings, and so forth, discovered in Tumuli 1 and 2 from 2023. So again, we're looking at relatively low degree of hierarchy, despite an absolutely astonishing investment of social capital in a huge monument. Okay, now let's move to the west, to the sort of the Carpathian and Moldavian areas. The Hillforts of the oh, I'm sorry. The heading here is mistaken. Of course, we should be looking at we're not looking at the Caucasus here. We're looking at the Moldavian plain, and we're looking in particular at two sites that are being investigated by the team of Alexandra Berzovan, Stanchevsky, 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 and Kotnari Catalina. These are large hill forts overlooking Prut River watershed, and these are again large and impressive hill forts with, to some degree, monumental elements, as we see here in Kotnari Catalina, with an impressive stone fortification wall with towers and stone masonry. That is down here in this cluster of hill forts. And then we see Stanchesti also is an interesting example with a certain amount of hierarchy starting to emerge here. Quite possibly, for example, in dwelling number 10, there were rich finds, including this wonderful sturgeon gold plaque that were stashed in a domestic unit. So are we looking at probably not an established kind of hierarchy within the settlement, but a certain deployment of objects of status that that eventually have potential to lead to development of hierarchy. Buneshti, here, number 22, is an interesting hill fort in which what was interpreted as a magic kit was stashed in dwelling number 32, and there was also a gold diadem. So the use of gold may well represent again, a sort of incipient hierarchy. Certainly, use of gold in this showy way to apply to a diadem is really we might be thinking of a movement towards a real hierarchy. Okay, good. Now we're coming to the Greater Caucasus and the region of especially Svaneti here. We can see a whole series of mining-oriented sites up in the High Caucasus that to some degree seem to be organized by larger settlements in the foothills like Syrte, and so we see, for example, Chuberi blooms and tuyers and slags found in this sort of small village kind of settlement. Slowly, it seems, by the 5th to the 4th century BC, we see, I'm not sure if we're really talking about hierarchy, but we are certainly talking about expression of individual prestige of some sort. It may well be connected to the production of metals in a kind of system that was organized through um, a sparsely populated landscape. Syrte is the one really major center that's been identified in this in the foothill area. Presumably, it's not the only one, but a very, very large it's connected to the to metal production processes, as we can see from some of the metal debris in discovered there, and also a number of wealthier tombs. And so what we may be looking at in Syrte is the emergence of an elite that is sort of connected to a broader territorial production. We can also think about elements, architectural elements, like this famous capital from Syrte with this lotus design. Um, or the building of uh, public architecture with large-scale, well-finished stone blocks. This site is so little explored at this point that it is has enormous potential to sort of enlighten the process of social evolution. Down in the Colchian Plain, in the area near Kutaisi or towards Vani, there are a number of small hill fort-like settlements that have moats and then are built up in a similar kind of distribution as we were talking about in Spain at the beginning of the lecture, in the earlier phase of Colchian culture. Jacek Hamburg uh, uh, is and Roland Isaacson are working on these in the region around Kutaisi. Uh, then, of course, there is Vani, which emerges in the late 5th and 4th century as a major center that is very much connected with highly prestigious lineages that extremely wealthy tombs that reflect a very wide catchment for the collection of wealth and prestigious objects that show wealth. Vani as well shows these monumental fortifications, monumental public architecture, as we see here. Um, so we see this transformation, 5th, 4th century, taking place in Vani as well. I think yeah, I should probably go quickly through my North Anatolian example, but Sinope, where I've worked for some 25, 30 years, also, contrary to what many people believe, actually has a rather extensive Iron Age distribution. Um, and uh, and much like we saw again in Spain with this widely distributed small fortified village pattern, we see very similarly in the Sinop hinterland in the highlands, something much like that. This is the fortified site of Tingarolu Tepesi, for example, with a fortified tower and walls surrounding a site that then has good visibility down the river valley towards the sea. And you can see a network of Iron Age sites that unite, in this case, around the river valley rather than in a sort of distribution across the plain. Um, there is also something much like what we saw in other cases in Samsun and Akalan, for example. We can see architecture here, which is much more monumental in its construction, something like the emergence of the impressive architecture at Vani, the incipient emergence of impressive monumental architecture in Romania. There also tends then by the 4th century BC to be a widespread distribution of these rock-cut tombs that certainly mark the emergence of important, uh, powerful lineages across the landscape. A hopefully to be explored in the near future. The Boyabat Castle, also an enormous site with very great potential as a probably a ritual as well as a residential center. Okay, so what are we looking at here then? In the early Iron Age, it seems like we've got this distribution of small settlements, but fortified, a certain amount of expenditure in by communities in a collaborative things. By the late Iron Age, so the 4th, 3rd century BC, all around the Black Sea, we see the emergence of these really impressive, large-scale dynasties uh, that are organizing large territories and concentrating wealth and monumentality uh, in what seem to be maybe royal lineages, right? And so to wrap up here, in the early Iron Age, we think we can see local power is has capacity to undertake large-scale community investments. Social organization does seem to be under segmentary principles. Social capital seems to be the dominant form of of social currency, although ritual, technological, and moral knowledge that we would call cultural capital does play a secondary role in the organization of these communities. Community-oriented investment includes ritual deposits, massive defensive architecture, and so forth. Um, and uh, and in the early Iron Age, much like in northwest Iberia, we see that power did not tend to pool up, didn't tend to collect at certain nodes. Instead, power is sort of tends to disperse generation to generation. In the Middle Iron Age, the mid part of the first millennium, we can see, I didn't get to explore this, but it seems that with the introduction of money, economic capital, there was a more efficient means of storing and deploying power from generation to generation and across particular communities and particular cultures. There's an expansion of the Black Sea commodities market during the sort of mid first millennium, um, and a greater potential then for actors with economic capital to buy labor at large scales for warfare, for monumental construction, and so forth. And the organization of society shifted from a balance of social and cultural capital to more of an emphasis on economic. And then finally, in the late Iron Age, that last slide I shared, we see coinage tends to be diversified into a much more subtle multi-level system. There is a much more tendency towards a lavish lifestyle. There's uneven political developments which lead to power pooling up, collecting at around lineages in places like Vani, Panticapaean, the Thracian kings, Macedonia, so forth, with then exaggerated, powerful dynasties, but other parts, other communities in the landscape, especially I would say most of the Greek cities on the coasts, these tend to uh, maintain a more sort of almost like the early Iron Age, a more communitarian focus. And then, of course, by the third century, we see these persistent power structures emerging across the region. So again, returning to Bourdieu, I think we can look at mobility and transcultural relations not for the identity of the objects and the habits that are appearing, but more just the way that these create opportunities for social innovation. The economic capital facilitated transcultural relationships as well as the mobility and the circulation and storage of social potential in metallic form. So in other words, it became possible to pass around social status and to store it from generation to generation in metallic form. Now, the habitus or the sort of worldview and culture of indigenous cultures became adapted to these new conditions. Um, and we see the movement from social position dependent largely on social capital, that is, on lineages and community membership, combined with the cultural capital, knowledge of ritual and behavior, to a late Iron Age system where social position was based on lineage and the exaggerated accumulation of economic capital. Well, I'd like to thank a number of people and institutions for making this research possible, the Getty Research Institute and the Getty Villa, KORC, the Consortium of American Overseas Research Centers, ARIT and ARISK in Turkey and in Tbilisi, the Yasha Archaeological Institute, the Krokowski Interdisciplinary Research Center in Kutaisi, the Sachdari Museum, and the Graclianis Gora excavations. I would very much like to also call out the support of Mr. Ömer Shen from Sinop, Dr. Alexandra Berzevan, Dr. Jacek Hamburg, and Mr. Shota Gubelidze for making very helpful, very useful contributions to what we've seen here. And so thank you for your attention.